So how can a single murder, a cold case that's decades old, actually help us understand a national crisis that's happening right now? It sounds like a stretch, right? But we're going to dive into this because the story we're about to unpack, well, it reveals something so much deeper than just one unsolved crime.
It all starts with a really stark, really painful question, one that hangs over an entire country. Why are Indigenous women in Canada so much more likely to be killed? It's a question with these deep, tangled roots that we really need to understand.
And believe it or not, a huge part of the answer, maybe even the key to understanding this whole crisis, it might just lie in a 27-year-old cold case. The case of a young woman named Alberta Williams. And in a piece of history that, I'm guessing, many of you were never taught.
Okay, so let's start with the case itself. We're going to go back to 1989, to a murder that has just completely puzzled investigators for decades. But now, a new voice, a new lead, has finally emerged.
So here are the basic facts of the case. Alberta Williams, she was a young Indigenous woman, and she disappeared in a town called Prince Rupert in British Columbia back in '89. The last time anyone saw her, she was at a gathering at her Uncle Jack's house. Her body was found weeks later, but for almost 3 decades, her murder has been cold, totally unsolved.
But then, after all that time, a potential breakthrough. A man named Brad Marsden decides to talk. And get this, he was in that house that night. He was asleep in a spare bedroom, maybe just 30 feet away from where Alberta was last seen alive.
And this right here is where the whole story takes a huge turn. Because when Brad Marsden starts talking, you realize his story isn't just about what he might have heard that one night. No, it's about something so much bigger.
You see, Brad's story gets to the very heart of all this. Today, he actually works as a facilitator, teaching people about the exact history we're about to get into. In his own words, he's able to acknowledge my history and relate it to the broader picture. He sees how his story, and Alberta's story, fit into this massive, countrywide narrative.
So that's the big question, right? You're probably thinking it. What on earth does a history lesson have to do with solving a murder that happened 27 years ago? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer is pretty much everything.
All right, to really connect these dots, we have to zoom way out. We have to look at what many people call Canada's darkest chapter, the Indian residential school system.
So for anyone who isn't familiar with this, let me be really clear. These were not just regular boarding schools, not even close. This was a whole network of institutions, funded by the Canadian government and run by churches. And they had one single, devastating goal: to assimilate Indigenous children, to literally erase their culture and identity.
And the scale of this it's just staggering. Just try to wrap your head around this number. Over 150,000. That's how many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forcibly taken from their homes, from their families. Some of these kids were as young as 4 years old.
And look, this wasn't some short-lived, terrible experiment. This system was running for more than 100 years, a century. Think about the kind of trauma that gets embedded into families generation after generation over that amount of time.
And this next part, this is the fact that usually stops people in their tracks. A lot of us think of this as, ancient history. But the very last residential school in Canada, it didn't close until 1996. 1996. That is absolutely within the lifetime of so many of us listening to this right now.
The official goal of this whole system, in the infamous words of one government official, was to kill the Indian in the child. Just think about that phrase. Kids were forbidden, punished for speaking their own languages. They were forced to abandon their culture, their beliefs. They suffered just widespread, horrific physical and sexual abuse, and thousands of children died in those schools. They never came home.
So let's bring this right back to our story. Remember Alberta's Uncle Jack, the man whose house she was last seen in? He is a survivor of the residential school system, and he puts it in a way that really hits home. He says, just imagine it. A government agent comes to your house right now and takes your child away. How would you feel?
Okay, so we've laid out the history. Now let's connect it to the present. Let's see how that trauma, that deep pain from the past, creates the exact kind of silence that has kept a murder case like Alberta's cold for decades.
And a really crucial idea to understand here is what's called an intergenerational survivor. That's what Brad Marsden calls himself. See, even though he never went to a residential school, he was raised by people who did. And all their trauma,
The pain, the fear, the deep mistrust, it all got passed down to him. It literally shaped his entire life.
So what you get is this powerful cycle of silence. It starts with the schools inflicting this incredible trauma. The survivors then carry that pain and a very understandable mistrust of authority back home. Then that trauma and that mistrust, it gets passed down to the next generation. So when something awful happens, like Alberta's murder, what do you think happens? Witnesses, people who might know something, they stay silent. Not for a day, not for a week, for decades.
And you might be wondering, why such a deep mistrust of the police in particular? Well, you have to remember, historically, it was the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who enforced the residential school system. They were often the ones showing up at the door to take the children, and if a kid managed to run away, it was the RCMP who would hunt them down and bring them back. This isn't ancient history. For these communities, it's a living, breathing memory that absolutely impacts police investigations today.
Okay, so now let's take all of that history, all of that context, and zoom right back in, back to that house in Prince Rupert, back to 1989. Because you're about to see how this history completely changes everything we thought we knew about Alberta Williams' case.
Okay, so remember Brad Marsden, the witness who was asleep in that spare room? Well, he revealed something absolutely critical to investigators. He wasn't alone in that room. His brother Doug was right there with him, asleep in the same room.
And what Doug remembers, it completely blows the official police theory out of the water. For years, the RCMP believed there was no party, that it was just Alberta and some unknown mystery person. But Doug says no, that's not what happened. He says he got up to use the bathroom and he saw a full-on party. He saw his Uncle Jack, he saw another woman named Carol, and he saw Alberta. And they were all there, laughing and making noise.
And this is probably the single most shocking fact in this entire story. Are you ready for this? In the 27 years since Alberta Williams was murdered, the RCMP has never once interviewed Doug Marsden. Never. Even though he was in the house, even though he saw her alive just hours before she vanished, he was an eyewitness, hidden in plain sight, silenced by that whole history of mistrust that kept him from talking and, frankly, kept the police from ever looking for him. So, what does this all mean in the end? It means that to solve just one murder, you first have to grapple with an entire nation's hidden history. The case of Alberta Williams shows us that the silence surrounding these tragedies, it's not random, it's not an accident, it is a direct legacy of that history. And it leaves us all with one final pretty haunting question. If a key eyewitness in a murder case can be missed for 27 years, what other truths, and who knows how many other cases are still out there just waiting to be heard?